Hello, everyone. My clock tells me that it's 1900 UTC, so it's time to get started. This is the DPRIVE working group at IETF 111. Welcome to virtual San Francisco. Your host for today, I'm Brian, and my affable sidekick Tim is driving all the slides. The main goal today is we're going to basically cover four main topics. Piece of logistics, just so everyone is aware, DPRIVE is actually meeting in two separate slots with a 30-minute break in between. We will have to switch Meet Echo rooms when we do that. So, our goal is to get as much of the agenda into the first slot, and then whatever bleeds over to the second slot will be in the second session. You want to move up to the next slide, Tim? So first things first, note well. More importantly, all of the rules here in the BCPs, everybody should be aware of. I would expect most of the people that have been to IETF meetings or know what these rules are. If you don't, please ask Tim or I, or check in with an AD, or just go read all these fun documents, and you'll be well informed of your responsibilities for participating in the IETF. Before we get started, I'd like to request a couple of volunteers. We would like someone who's willing to take notes using the Code EMD link that's in the chair slide, and we need someone who's willing to, help relay any questions that come up in the Jabber room. Anybody willing to do that?
Happy to relay from Jabber.
Thank you, Jonathan. Anybody willing to act as a note taker and collaborate in the note taking, so we have accurate minutes of what goes on today?
I'm happy to give it a try, but I'm a newbie.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, generally what will end up happening is people will also jump in and help do corrections. So if you capture the main points, then other people can
Shane
help,
just offered to take notes too.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. All right, so now that we have those.
I didn't mean to volunteer. I'm sorry. I'm actually short of monitor space right now. I was trying to point out that Shane just volunteered.
Oh, Shane did. Okay,
so maybe
great.
Shane and Jenny can collaborate on the notes.
See, I keep trying to wrap you into more stuff, Daniel. I'll keep trying. All right, Tim, next slide, please. So, kind of the meta agenda. We'll go over what we're going to talk about today and ask if there are any updates or changes to it. We don't have to worry about blue sheets because Meet Echo will capture everybody who joins the meeting, and those will be reported as the official blue sheets. Updates on old work, really the only thing to report, and I'll just go ahead and do it now, is we do have the zone transfers document in Auth 48, so that's getting very close to being an RFC. And then the rest of the agenda will be broken up between current working group business and new working group business. Next slide, Tim, please. If you have questions on any of the documents that we talk about, you can find that on our data tracker page. And for our current working group business, we're going to go over the status of the DNS over Quick document, and then we'll have an update on the unauthenticated encryption from recursive to authoritative. Any changes or additions for current working group business on the agenda? Okay, I'll take that as everybody's happy with that part of the agenda. Next slide, Tim. The second part will be new working group business. We have two topics. One is a discussion by Paul Wooters on new record types and parent zones. And the second one will be on the status of the signaling authoritative DNS encryption from Eric Rescorla. Any changes or additions or deletions to our new working group business? Paul.
Since the first discussion is actually part of this, what's being done in the second discussion, it might make sense to flip these two around. I haven't seen the other presentations, so I'm not sure if that makes sense, but maybe Ecker can say something if he agrees that might be better the other way around.
But I think, oh, if Alice wants to go first, I'm happy to have that too. Yes, no?
No,
okay.
Eric, why don't you go ahead and answer the question?
Sure, yeah. I'm happy to go either way, but I just looked over Paul's slides and it seems like, I think my slides, I think Paul and I agree that SVCB is not like immediately practical in like the immediate term, probably, but on the other hand, I'm more sanguine on the other alternatives. So I think we need to have I think we certainly need to have Paul's negative view represented if we're going to make any progress in the discussion on the other thing. So I don't care who presents first. I'm happy to present first or second. I mean, one might see that it'd be sensible to have me go first in the sense that, like, then I can say, like, well, I think this is probably okay, and then Paul can say it's like not okay. But I think we shouldn't. I think I should have the discussion jointly.
Okay. Alex.
Alex Mayo for NICTAD. I just want to mention very briefly that as an author of the phase 2 requirements draft, I understand that the consensus of the working group has been that we won't renew that draft, and it's sort of like being overtaken by the other documents that we have in the working group. So unless somebody speaks up, we won't put any additional work in that document. Is that correct? Is that the feeling of the working group and the chairs as well?
That was the assessment that Tim and I had when we asked the question of the working group. So if other people have disagreements with that assessment and they see value in that work moving forward, then we would like to hear about it and how it might address some of the comments and concerns that were raised about trying to keep that document up to date and moving forward. All right, so maybe to get to Paul's request, we'll go ahead and do these presentations in the reverse order, and we'll have Eric go first, and then Paul can talk afterwards. And I do like the idea of having it as being more of a joint discussion after both presentations, so that we can talk about the issues rather than specific presentation materials. Any other comments on the agenda? All right, so let's go ahead and get going. Sarah, are you ready to talk about DNS over Quick?
Yep.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm going to give an update on the DNS over Quick specification. Next slide, please. Very quick little bit of background. We started work on this in 2017. The draft was adopted by DPRIVE in 2020. Earlier this year, Quick was published as an RFC. And we also presented on this draft at the last IETF meeting at 110. And there was quite a bit of discussion there about the scope of the document and thoughts on the mapping. And so we've done an update where we hope that we have captured everything that was said in that last discussion about what people want to do with the specification. Next slide, please. So the updates that we made in the latest draft after that discussion, the biggest one is that based on feedback, we have redefined the scope of it to make it what we've said is a general purpose transport for DNS. So we explicitly make clear that it covers stub to recursive, as it originally did in the earlier versions, but now also recursive to authoritative, for which I guess the acronym is ADOC. And also zone transfer, which was something people were keen to see this protocol support, which it couldn't previously with the mapping. And if we care about an acronym for that, I think it would be ZOC. But there we go. Next slide, please. The second big update was that we have now gone ahead and switched to the new stream mapping. So this includes a 2 octet length on all the messages, on queries and responses. And we now support on a single stream that you can send a single query, but you can receive multiple responses on that stream. And that's how we will support XFR. I see a comment about ALPN, and yes, it just uses the doc ALPN. Next slide, please. The other update we did is we have clarified the handling of protocol errors and introduced a specific protocol error. This is for things like non-zero transaction IDs and the use of some EDNS 0 options, which are not appropriate when used over QUIC. We'd appreciate feedback. That the approach that we've got at the moment is quite strict, and we treat all of these as errors. It will make it interesting for proxies in that they will have to handle this if they're proxying from other transports. So feedback on whether the current approach is the right one would be appreciated. Next slide, please. And lastly, again, based on the feedback that we got last time, we've changed the port request, and the document now suggests that we request 853. We haven't put any request in at the moment. So this is another thing we would very much like feedback on. We discuss in the IANA considerations section that this would be shared with DNS over DTLS. We propose that this is acceptable because that specification is experimental. It's several years old, and to my knowledge, there are no implementations or deployments of it. And also, QUIC was specifically developed to coexist on a port with DTLS, so there's no technical issue there. Next slide, please. So a very quick oversight of the change in the mapping from the previous version. The old mapping was exceptionally clean, very UDP-like. You had one query and one response per stream. Obviously that had limitations. So the new mapping is more TCP-like. You now on stream have a query and multiple responses, although we're still limited to one exchange per stream. Next slide, please. So questions on the draft that we would like the working group to wade in on are, is there general support for the new mapping that's now in the specification and for the new scope? There are, in terms of changing that mapping and compatibility, there are several experimental implementations of the previous mapping which are using the ALPN doc I02. There is one deployment by AdGuard of this. To my knowledge, they are using port 784 as the earlier drafts recommended to do for experimentation. I've done some proof of concept work on the new mapping. So that's a starting point, and I'm hoping to work more, if the working group supports the change in mapping, on updating the other implementations and some interop. I think that would be the next step if we have support for this. We did reach out to Andre from AdGuard to see if he had any more operational feedback. He had a few performance numbers, but I'm not sure we can draw any clear conclusion because they look quite implementation specific. He did say, I don't think he's here. No, he's not, so I'll just relay some of his comments. The other one was that they are happy enough with their doc implementation that they're considering making it the default for their apps. And he also made a comment that he thought QUIC worked rather well across the Great Firewall of China, in that he thought TLS and HTTPS degraded a lot, but Quick seems to perform much better, was his quote. So that's just operational reference points. One thing just to clarify for people who haven't read the draft is that the authentication model for ADOC is deliberately deferred in the specification. We say that it is a work in progress and it will be defined in other documents produced by the working group. So essentially what we're doing here is specifying purely the transport aspect, which should be enough to enable experimentation with this between recursive and authoritative. There have been a few discussions around message size limits. For this specification, our intention is to retain the 64 kilobyte limit for exactly the same reasons as was done for DOE and DOT, largely to do with proxying. We don't see a compelling use case at this point to complicate the specification by lifting that. So that's all the updates on the specification. So I'm happy to take questions and comments. I saw some talk scrolling past on ports in the chat, so I presume somebody will want to speak to that.
So any questions from the working group? Alex?
Alex Mayhofer. First off, I really like the change of DOQ to a general purpose protocol. I think it's worthwhile because it will evolve over time. It will undoubtedly be used in other scenarios that the -02 draft was like allowing. And the second thing that's more like a minor thing, the draft at some point says that server initiated transactions are out of scope. I think that the text might need a small clarification that DNS notify is technically not a server initiated transaction. But I'm unsure how to reflect that in the document.
Oh, I see. So
between other master with primary and secondary name servers, DNS notify is essentially it's a query technically, but still it's like initiated by a server. So it might confuse some people. Confuse the colleague of mine who said so you can't do notify with DOQ.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, we can put text in to take care of that.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thanks for the work.
Thanks.
So Sarah, quick question from me. Where do the authors think this document is in relation to being ready for a working group last call?
So I think at this point we're pretty happy with how it looks. What we would like to be sure of is that we've captured what the working group wants on the question of scope and mapping. And I've had some offline comments to say that other people think it's in the right direction. And beyond that, I think we're at the stage of tidying some things up and clarification, particularly around the error handling, because that's new. So my feeling would be an initial round of review based on what are some big changes. And if those are mostly minor, I think we would be looking to move it towards working group last call at that point in time.
Okay. Shane.
Yes, thank you. Hey, Sarah.
Hey.
I admit I haven't read this, so don't hate me. But you mentioned that XOQ transfers are now in this draft. We have kind of separate RFCs for a lot of other transfer stuff. Transfer over TLS is separate, right?
Yeah.
I guess it seems to me like it might be a different of enough type of thing that having a separate draft might make sense. I don't know how much overlap there would be if something like that was attempted.
So what we do in the current draft is we essentially say it's just like zone transfer over TLS, except you're using Quick. In the sense of the authentication model is the same and connection reuse is largely the same.
Okay.
And I did think about trying to dive into that, and I did just find myself repeating a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm 50-50 on that. I think
No, that
it's probably worth me going back and taking another look whether it's a subsection to clarify, because there are subtle differences in, you know, in obviously in the TLS one, we're talking about reusing TCP connections as opposed to reusing quick connections.
right.
But I'm not sure there's anything. I guess the big question is there anything that would be ambiguous to an implementer that would cause interop problems? So maybe it's worth revisiting it with that kind of thinking head on to see if it does need more specification here or even splitting out.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I'll have a read and see if I can have an informed opinion about that. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, Shane. Paul.
Paul Hoffman. So I have read the recent draft, and I think it is just fine for ZOC. That is, that the level of taking that out and making that a 2-page or a 3-page RFC, actually I think would be harmful, because really the interesting parts are doing the quick stuff. So if we know that that's a thing that we want, I would certainly leave it in, and I think it's well defined. I mean, not that I'm a XFR expert, but I think it hit the points that I expected in the current draft, so I would suggest leaving it in. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions for Sarah? All right, Sarah, what Tim and I will do is we'll take an action item to ping the working group to see how they feel about the current state of the document. And if we get more positive responses, then we'll probably start a working group last call.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Paul, you are up on deck.
Great, thank you. So as some of you may have noticed, that the chairs gave us 30 minutes for this slot. I have 4 slides, which would indicate either I have to talk really, really slow or you have to ask a million questions. So hopefully folks have been following along on the working group about this draft. This is just an update of where we are today. Next slide. So we recently published the 03. This was a little bit before the deadline for the meeting. But before that, since the last meeting, there had been a discussion of, it seems like there's going to be a lot of overlap, common stuff between unauthenticated and the fully authenticated. So we actually split out features that we thought would be in common and published 2 drafts, the common features draft and 02. And people really didn't like that, so we went back to recombining it. And again, things can be split out later if people change their mind, if the working group changed their mind yet again. But this is where we're at now, and it seems okay. Next slide. So we know that there are a couple of outstanding issues. None of these are horrible, and I think it will come down to just having a little bit of discussion about each. The first one is port probing, especially for DOT. Could also be port probing for DOH and DOQ. So for the unauthenticated case, port probing is not a big deal because it can happen lazily. You know, you look in your cache, you say, oh, look, there's an NS record, and I don't know whether they do DOT or whatever. Therefore, and I want to know, and I go out and I look for an SVCB record and I don't see it. And I think, well, let's just check the port. Maybe they haven't published an SVCB record, and the port's open. And it's like, great, I will mark that. We certainly don't want to say to do that because that would cause a lot of probing, and especially for TCP connections that could add overhead and things like that. But maybe it's just fine to do that, and the result would of course for allowing port probing would be would have more encryption on the internet, so that would be good. So really, if people agree with that thought, it would really be for the draft, the eventual RFC we would want to say at what level, like, I don't think it should be a should, it could be a may, and there'll be plenty of people who don't want to do port probing. So just as a possible option, we know people are doing it now. Right now, the draft, it really talks about the the advantages and disadvantages because of TCP, which completely ignores DOQ. And truth be told, I think 5 years from now, after this is well implemented, the vast majority of it's going to be over DOQ. So we need to do a better job of actually talking about DOQ, not just in the it's possible, but also in the specifics about how much overhead there's going to be and such like that. So we need to add more there, and we'd love help on that. And the IANA considerations is basically a stub with questions right now. So once we get closer to being finished, we'll obviously fill that in. But that's about it for our known outstanding issues. Next slide. So, and this is the last slide, is that all? Probably not. There will probably be more issues. We certainly hope to hear from y'all on that. The more issues that you bring up with this document, the more issues that can be dealt with earlier in the fully authenticated work. And also the sooner we can get it done. So we'd love to see this, get moving forwards a little bit faster, with a little bit more interest, because this can be completed without waiting for the fully authenticated work to complete or even to get very mature. That is, this can be done. There's a lot of people who are interested in doing this, who are also interested in doing fully authenticated when it gets, finally done. So it might be good to have this out there and people actually implementing it, such like that. So that's it. That's the last slide. We would love to hear more, either on the list or right now, certainly right now, but on the list. And if there isn't that much more, then Peter and I can do a quick revision to handle the stuff on slide 3, and we can be ready for working group last call if that's what people want.
Any comments or questions for Paul?
Sarah, please.
Just to say that I do think it would be nice to generalize this to all the encrypted transport, particularly with the level of interest we're seeing in docs. So I could certainly try and help out with those edits.
Yep. And again, I seriously, just looking at the way the world keeps like being attracted to doc and to quick and stuff like that, I could totally see it wiping out DOT over time. So yeah, great, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Jeff.
Brian.
Oh.
I'm way behind on contributing, and you want to contribute, so expect me to find more cycles on this and some related things for the parental side thing. So both of those, it's unrelated to this per se, but the other thing that's going to be presented.
Yeah. So just to be clear, Brian, we have removed any discussion at all of the parental side in the 03 document. We had mentioned it in 02 as it might be there, but because of the questions that are going to come up later in the meeting, and we don't need it, we took that out. So that's not at all relevant for us moving forwards.
Exactly. I want to keep it separate as well. And I think even the parental, securing the parental delegation piece is probably something that it's needed for DPRIVE work, but I think it might actually belong in DNSOP. So I'm going to try and push
Brian,
that forward
can
there.
we not do that as part of this discussion? Okay, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Jeff.
Look, I was just going to take up your final point on that slide in front of me, where you say this document can be completed without waiting for the fully authenticated work, and merely putting in a request to say this document either should or will be completed without waiting for the fully authenticated work to complete.
Sure.
I think authentication is a much thornier issue, given that and also given that authoritatives are promiscuous answerers, the whole issue around authentication of who you're asking versus what you are asking about needs more thought. But that shouldn't preclude this transport and this approach being used without authentication pumped out right now, with the caveat that authentication will follow is probably a better approach. So my own preference would be ship it now and leave the full authentication as a placeholder for further work. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Paul.
Okay, of course, I'm just going to say the exact reverse of that. I think we should, authentication is relatively straightforward these days, especially if you're going to use the same transports like TLS and Quick. You should really be able to figure out what certificate to use, what identity to use, and just complete that work and skip this part so that it can just be clear that a client connecting and has some sort of TLS negotiation error, it knows that it's a failure and doesn't have to worry about whether it should be opportunistic now or fail completely. So I still think there's too little value in this work, and we should just go for the fully authenticated part.
So since you, as you started at the beginning, you said you'll just say it again. I'll say it again. It's clear that you're wrong about that it'll be easy to do. I mean, just look at the mailing list for the last 6 months.
And I think the order of work and the interest that has been expressed in the two, this is something where we need to at least get it to a point where it's ready for experimentation so that we can actually see if it works the way that people expect it to work or it breaks the way that people expect it to break. All right, Watson.
Yeah, Watson. I'm maybe a little confused because of my relative lack of knowledge about the DNS, but it looks like the signal is entirely dependent on being able to resolve the name server's name. And so in particular, they have names and you can get a certificate and validate against it. And it's not clear to me why, what is unauthenticated here? Is it just that we're not going to use the web PKI for some reason? Or is it merely that the signal about that you support encryption could be interfered with? I think the second one would be preferable. Where we
so
are
Watson, I think your question is actually for the next group of people, not for this one. That is, I thought we were clear in this draft, and if not, I can redo it. That we're simply saying go through TLS, but if the authentication fails, keep going. So the how you got an authenticated identity, where you got it, and things like that is not at all for this, and it's very much important for the fully authenticated version. Does that make sense?
No, I don't think. I mean, why not require X509 validate? You're already 90% of the way there. You've got an identity from the record that you expect to connect to.
So you're saying why not just do web PKI equivalent identity?
Yeah, I mean, web PKI or I hesitate to bring up Dane just because of the deployment issues and the support issues, but you have a DNS name which both of these are based on.
Okay, so it would be hard to answer your question without repeating things that have been being said on the list for the last year. But basically there are two use cases. One is where you never want to fail, but you do want to have encryption. And the other use case is you really want to have very good privacy. This is the first use case, and the folks who are speaking next are speaking to the second use case. So I'm not sure if that answered it enough, but I would definitely say review the archives from the last year or so, because this is very much why we are having two use cases, not one.
Okay, Ben.
Hi. So this draft has changed a little bit since the last time I looked at it. I've generally been of the opinion that we should have a draft documenting how to do opportunistic ADOT. But after looking at this one, I don't think so. So I think I disagree with a few different things that have been said. I disagree with the idea that this can proceed or should proceed ahead of the authenticated encryption. I think they have to proceed together. They're actually very tightly, the designs are tightly coupled. In fact, they're so tightly coupled that I think that this draft, as currently written, is incompatible with draft ADOX. They cannot both be standardized.
Well, then that's a mistake on our part. We certainly wanted them to be able to be.
Break it in the wild, because this draft says you can set up a server with an SVCB a name server with an SVCB record on it, and you can put the wrong certificate on that, and nothing is going to break.
For this use case, correct.
And draft ADOX says exactly the opposite. It says if you're a recursive resolver and you run into a name server that sets up that has the wrong certificate on its has an SVCB record and the wrong certificate, you fail hard. So the result of that is that if if this comes out first and name servers out in the wild start relying on it and putting up self-signed certificates and have working unauthenticated encryption, then any recursive resolver that tries to implement draft ADOX will find that they're unable to connect to those servers, and will actually serve fail for those servers. So I think we need to fix this and make these drafts compatible. And I think that Watson is basically on the right track here. Looking at this draft now, it seems to me that what it's describing, or what it should be describing, is not really unauthenticated encryption, but late authenticated encryption, or possibly actually something that resembles the IETF's official opportunistic encryption. So you attempt to do the encryption setup, and an intermediary can block your access to the SVCB record potentially, in which case you're stuck. You can't do this upgrade, and you're probably going to do this late because you don't want to block the resolution process. So you're asynchronously trying to fetch this record. But once you've got it, then you need to be fully authenticated and fail hard if TLS tells you to fail.
So that's on the assumption that the working group adopts WebPKI as compared to using Dane records. And
it
that
is
would,
not on that. It is not on that assumption. It is on the assumption that we have any authentication mechanism, Dane or WebPKI.
Okay.
We need to agree
I think I
about
see
what
what you're saying.
happens when authentication fails.
So
And there can only
you're
be one
arguing
answer.
against the use case that you should go forwards regardless, because there may be a later use case where authentication is the normal kind of authentication that we're used to in TLS is required.
Right.
Okay. So if the working group agrees on that and wants to change the use case, we would obviously have to change the document name yet again. But we could, and then simply go with that direction of not being the fully privacy enhanced kind of thing that we're going to talk about next, where you have the parent stuff ahead of time so that the attacker, that the viewer cannot see what you're trying to get. But then say, and if you've gone through TLS and it doesn't authenticate with whatever authentication mechanism, then stop and you're going to get a serve fail.
Right.
Okay. So that may be a third use case, or it may be that people really want that use case more than the unauthenticated use case. And we can certainly discuss that in the working group.
Thanks.
Denise.
With the Google Public DNS hat on. So I'm not going to rehash just the very technical discussion between Ben and Paul, but I just wanted to say that Google Public DNS is reviewing what we can do in terms of opportunistic encryption to various name servers. Given our capacity, I think for us, for high volume connections, being able to do even some amount of unauthenticated encryption has value because it prevents passive eavesdropping on user queries. And we are willing to experiment with name servers who want to test this functionality out. At this point, we are already doing some amount of manually configured authenticated DNS over TLS to a few name server providers, including Facebook. That's all.
Thanks.
Ecker.
So I think first of all, I share, I think, Ben Watson's concern about this document and having to go forward at this stage. But I think more generally, it seems to me that there are three. There's a respect in which there's a respect in which these pieces of technology are connected and respect in which they are not, right? So I mean, what this document says is you can stand up a authoritative with no valid credentials whatsoever, and then people might find some way to discover it, but you're going to, there's no way to protect against man-in-the-middle attack or any kind of active attack because there's no authenticated discovery mechanism. What the ADOCS draft says is here's an authenticated discovery mechanism, and then once you have an authenticated discovery mechanism, that bootstraps you up to an expected credential, and therefore you need an authenticated credential to make the connection. There's at least one other point in the spectrum, which is that we not describe how you discover that the server ought to be authenticated, but the server is required to have a valid credential. And so I think this is roughly the case that Ben was alluding to, which is you remove the section of this draft that says if you keep this draft the same as it is, but except that you'd say if you connect the thing and you don't get a valid, like what PKI cert, then I don't know, you fall back or something, right? Whether that would be good or not, I think is unclear. Or what PKI ordained, I'm not fighting about that. Whether it be clear, but it's another point. It's another point in the space, right? It's like not clear to me that because it's very much. I just want to observe that's relevant. Yeah, I mean, I think it is important that semantics, that to the extent to which this is signaled by SVCB, those semantics have to be the same. Or we need to have disjoint SVCB semantics, right? It can't be the case that SVCB says simultaneously expect and do not expect a secure connection, right?
That's reasonable.
Now, I mean,
that's reasonable.
I want to say it's but that said, it wouldn't be a disaster if it turned out that we. While I don't think this document is what I would do, if we were to publish this document and then we were to later decide we want to use SVCB signaling for ADOCS, we just invent some new flag that said you have to be encrypted. So I don't think it's the end of the world if these things advance in parallel. At least not for that reason.
So before you go, Ecker, you said a thing in the middle which I have not heard anyone say, but then you hand waved it, and I would like to hear your opinion.
Well, it may be really dumb, so
Hey, well, let me say it then. So you said somebody, a resolver goes to a authoritative server, they get through TLS, and they try to authenticate and it fails. And then you said, well, maybe they start over. But that was a maybe. In that case, given that you don't like this use case at all, and you've said that many times, and that's fine, what would you say would be the correct thing? Because we're saying move forwards anyways. Are you saying act like regular TLS, stop, say this is not a server that I can be doing TLS to, and then go back to just plain port 53?
Well, so I guess there are a couple options. I mean, I think that I think there are part of the problem is there's some confusion about how you discover this case, right? Yep. I think in your so I guess what I would say is it's not clear to me why it makes sense to have an SVCB record that says I do TLS, but an invalid cert. or an invalid Dane thing or whatever, right? Like given that they're so easy to get both of those, like why is that an asset? And the advantage of that would be that as Ben indicated, that would be forward compatible with some sort of SVC being the parent thing, right? So one way to think about this is like, is like a la SSH, right? Is that if you were to say that the semantics of SVCB were there better be TLS and it better work, then once you got to there, then you'd be tofu'd into some sort of like something with forward compatible. And then if you ever invented a mechanism to like for the parent to tell you that this would be TLS, that would all just work magically, as opposed to the situation where you'd have this sort of like and I think like that would still allow you to have some probing case where when you probed, you were like, if you like had no external knowledge, you could say, well, I'll accept any bogus cert I want because like whatever. But then if if you get like the SVB thing, then you assume then you I think I'm not saying this is great. I'm just saying like I'm trying to think about how do we like if we are going to do this, how do we pave the way to eventually being authenticated rather than sort of create some sort of like side branch which you never can get out of.
Right. I agree with you because even though I don't have the fully authenticated use case, I never want a resolver to give a wrong answer. I know that many people do want that. So you've just suggested a few things. I'm going to think about it. I almost think, even though it's a terrible suggestion, it might be the least terrible one, which is the last thing you said, which is for the unauthenticated use case, don't look for SCVB, just do probe. And if you get an SVCB, that means you're in this other use case over here.
And I have to think about this more because I just made this up.
I know, I understand. That prevents DOH, but it definitely allows DOT and DOQ.
Yeah, well, it would allow, and why you want to I have no idea, but it would allow actually bootstrap up from like, it would allow bootstrap up from DO53 to DO, if for some reason you want, or from DOT to DO, right?
Okay.
Like I say, why you want that.
I see a bunch of other people in the queue. That's
great.
I just want to point out that this question of is that all has definitely been answered as no.
So I'm going to go ahead and close the queue after Christian. Robert.
Robert Evans. I work with Google Cloud DNS. I wanted to point out that I don't see an incompatibility here between the two proposals for unauthenticated / opportunistic versus authenticated. The distinction is about signaling. If we invent a protocol or specification or other means to say this name server should have an authenticated identity, then we can apply that to connections for resolvers that support it. When that signal is not present or the resolver does not support that signal, then we can proceed with unauthenticated or opportunistic. And it's a matter of evolution where we begin with experience around encryption, and then we can move on to signaling in a protocol that says it should have an authentication. And we need to be able to convey that securely for the ecosystem to work securely. So it is sort of a staged deployment where we'll see more and more security around conveying that fact. And today, the parents cannot convey that with security today. Maybe in the future we can, and it's going to take some iteration before we can convey the authentication signal securely. So anyway, just reiterating my perspective is they're compatible if we say future authentication signaling becomes a requirement for resolvers that adopt it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Victor.
Hi. So Robert provided the perfect intro to what I was going to say, which is that way back in RFC 7435, one of the things that was defined was opportunistic, but with downgrade resistant signaling of authentication versus not. And so that's certainly anticipated quite some years back. And the other thing is that in the SMTP specs for opportunistic DANE, one of the things that said is that if your DANE parameters are unsupported, but TLSA record is found and is secure, that you go ahead and mandate TLS, but don't authenticate because you don't have parameters that you can use. So unusable DANE is a signal for unauthenticated but required TLS in the SMTP space. That can be repeated here if desired. So you could use DANE with deliberately unusable parameters, certificate usage 3 or something. Not certificate usage, selector 3, which is undefined. And then all of a sudden, you can't use the TLSA record as such to do authentication, but you can use it as a signal to say they want TLS. So there are ways of doing this in a Dane space.
Yeah.
Right.
I think Paul Wouters had suggested that earlier. And just for the folks in here who are not familiar with the work that Victor has done on Dane with SMTP, there are tens of millions of servers doing this constantly. The fact that you get email at all is based on this. So it's not, this would not, what he is suggesting is not like a new weird experiment. It's something that is widely used today, quite silently.
2.6 million, but 10 million, fine. I'll take the.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thanks, Victor.
Okay.
Brian Dixon.
Keep it simple, not go too far into the weeds. I think one of the things for a weak signal, but a signal that needs to be trusted is the name server, the name of the name server, is it in a signed zone? And if it is, then it's reasonable to then expect or at least look for a TLSA record. And if it's not there, do some kind of opportunistic. If it is there, if there is a TLSA record, use it at hard fail. I think that's a weak signal. It's very much like
actually,
what
I think it's quite a strong signal. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. And the other observation is for some of the ADOX things like DOH, if there is a need from their side to do web PKI, the TLSA record types support a requirement for web PKI validation. So I think if we could then say, if you're going to do that, you have to do TLSA, because it's really easy to do and say, okay, TLSA type the 0, which says, okay, here's your CA fingerprint, and that is scalable, it's validatable, it forces web PKI, but the TLSA of the other types doesn't require or force web PKI, and would, I think, that would justify always requiring TLSA, I think. And I don't think there's a significant burden or overhead on that.
Okay, I think that's complicated enough. If you could write that up and send it to the list, that would be great.
Absolutely.
All right, Daniel.
Hi, folks. Thanks for thinking this through. We've been around this particular merry-go-round before, not just in the DNS, but in things like what Victor was describing in his work with SMTP. I just want to point out that we have to think about two different cases here. We have to think about the perspective of the recursive resolver and what do they want to do when they run into failures, and we have to think about the deployer of the authoritative resolver, the authoritative name server, not a resolver, right? Do they want to deploy this thing at the risk of getting their entire zone locked out if they screw it up? And there is always a risk that it will get screwed up, right? It can get screwed up because you forgot to renew a cert. It can get screwed up because your DNSX signatures didn't work right. It can get screwed up because of a range of different, reasons that, there's this software, right? Software fails. And people might want, with SMTP, we said, with the MTA STS mechanism, we said, look, we want to be able to, an operator wants to be able to ask for reports when there are failures, not just automatically have the thing take their zone out, right? They want to collect reports, they want to deploy over time and do it gradually. That's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about. How do we build the mechanism so that we can encourage the managers of the authoritative server to pick this up? That's the only thing I think that this particular draft is doing, is it's saying, look, here's a mechanism you can roll it out for. It's not going to break your zone, right? You can roll this out. You don't have to think about the signaling. You shouldn't have to think about the signaling, and you can just roll this out. And we should be thinking about how do we get a report in for it, right? This is to specify for an authoritative operator so that they can roll it out. They can say, I'm offering encryption, but I'm not worried that I'm going to break things for people who are querying the zone, right? That's the question that we should be looking at. And but my second point was just that I think it was Brian who said, the presence of the TLSA record. We have to consider the in bailiwick question here, right? If we're talking about TLSA records for the zone that you are authoritative for, and your name is within that zone, you have an in bailiwick name server, you have an issue. Now, people can say in bailiwick name servers are not a good idea. There certainly are cases where they're not a good idea, but at some point there's a loop, right? Even if no one did in bailiwick name servers, if you want to resolve anything, you need to resolve stuff in some kind of to learn what. Imagine this was deployed for everyone. There's going to end up being a loop, and that loop is the equivalent of an in bailiwick name server, right? So we need to be thinking about that for the signaling part of it as well. Anyway, I think that's it.
Thanks.
And Christian.
I am looking at this from an implementer point of view. If I am implementing, say, a recursive or something like that, and I'm going to use a stack. I'm going to use a TLS stack or a quick stack or something like that. And those stacks in practice require that I use a server name. And they require that there is a certificate that matches the server name. They don't require that that server name has any particular characteristic or tied to the DNS hierarchy. But if I do not have a server name, the connection is just going to fail. Because, it will fail somewhere in the middle of a weird open SSL stack or whatever that I have no control about. So, yeah, it might not be entirely true in theory that you need that, but in practice, it sucks. So I'd like to be really clear about what server name I shall use and how do I get it.
Okay, if we have not been clear in the draft, we certainly should be, because we talked about using the server name that you had in the cache for the NS record. But if that was not clear, we can make that clearer.
That's fine. In that case, the stacks that I use are going to check that there's a certificate for that name. They're not going to check for anything else.
And then if you're using a stack that will fail when the authentication fails, then that's your choice to use that stack. Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's not exactly a choice, because the average developer doesn't want to dive too deep into re-engineering the SSL stack. So yeah.
Okay.
And so the choice would be clear. For me, what makes it I would say opportunistic part is that, okay, that may fail for some reason. And if I am in an opportunistic mode, it's okay to go back to using port 53 or something like that. That's really the choice for me. The choice between strict and not strict is that if I am strict, fail mean fails. If I'm not strict, fails mean try UDP.
Okay. So I'm hearing that from a few people. I think that that's something that would be really good to discuss on the mailing list, of having this be a higher level with a fallback to unencrypted, and see if that's of interest. We certainly heard the other from other people as well. So since we're about 2 minutes before we have to shut off anyways, I want to be clear that was incorrect. I was also incorrect about us not taking our whole 30 minutes. If folks want to start discussions on the mailing list for these use cases, that's great. If not, Peter and I will do so early next week. But we obviously have a bunch more to think about before we move this forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. And what we want the minutes to reflect is Tim and I will take an action to try and kick off discussions on some of these points once we've gotten over the IETF meeting. and we can
Yeah,
try
and
get to resolution.
the biggest point on that, Brian, would be which are new use cases and which are improvements to this use case.
Right, got it.
Yep.
Okay, we have 10 seconds left. We're going to reconvene at 20:30, so you've got a half hour for your various caffeine breaks that you want, and the goal will be to discuss the next two presentation items and use the rest of the time for discussion to those. So with that, we'll wrap up this session, and we will see you in about 30 minutes. Thanks all.